Welcoming Peter and Tim from PT Games today. Tim, I'd seen a highly informative update video you gave on May 20th. And if I may just do a really brief rundown, Peter and Tim share a gaming history that goes back more than 30 years, originating in the D&D and other fantasy type game realm and progressing into sports. You currently offer a basketball game that covers the NBA, the WNBA, and college, although college stats you indicated are very hard to get. Hockey Bones, which is kind of an updated and more consistent version of Face Off. And then, Tim, you said football, which is your baby, PTG football and a solo version. And for the past 2.5 years, you've been working on a PC version that is more of a career sim, full-blown career sim, not just a C&D or pro helper game. It's more of an out of the park or draft day type game. And you apparently are rating players on a whopping 350 categories. Just amazing. Is that a good wrap up of where you are today?
Yeah, that's a pretty good wrap up.
Awesome,
Yeah.
Awesome. So how did you gentlemen get into gaming and how did you begin a partnership?
So we've been friends since 1978. We actually met on the bus in 7th grade. We lived like one bus stop apart, and it just kind of went from there. So yeah, we've known each other forever. He actually introduced me to Dungeons and Dragons. I play sports games, board games and computer games a lot. So it's just kind of, developed from there. And he and I have been friends for so long. And a few years ago, approached him when I came home. I was doing a PhD. I became ill and I came home. I approached him about this football game that I've been designing and messing with for years. I'd actually been in a face-to-face Statis Pro football league for 28 years. It was great. It was awesome. Lifelong friends kind of thing. And, truly face-to-face, right? Sit right across from the table and have at it. I had been messing with the Statis Pro engine over the years. Statis Pro, of course, Jim Barnes and Avalon Hill closed it out. We actually, as our league, we contacted Avalon Hill because half of our league was lawyers. We actually contacted Avalon Hill and said, hey, is it okay if we make our own cards, but we're not going to sell them? So we did, and good to go. And we kept going for another, 10 years or something. I was messing with the formulas in the game and the way that Statis Pro plays. I originally started with Statis Pro baseball and played that for hundreds of games. And actually did a couple of different of my own season replays. I did a 83 and an 87 replay, Dodger replays. I was so fascinated with the Statis Pro football engine. I just tinkered with it and wrote up various game designs and did various things. And then at some point, I don't remember exactly when, 2010 maybe, so 2012, somewhere in there, I decided to put out a game called Football Bones, which I was going to be a Bones game, a family of games, right? Hasbro's family of games. I was going to copy the same theme. And I put out Football Bones and it had a pretty good reception. There were a few people that were interested in it. And after a few years, I had someone came to me and said, hey, the Bones imagery and the name really frightens me. And I was like, okay, fine, I'll change the name, right? So I called it PT Games Football for about 10 minutes. And then I shortened it to PTG, which somebody told me about a company called Player of the Game or something back in the 50s and 60s. And I was like, okay, sorry. But I like PTG because it's PT Games. And I've taken this game design, and then a few years ago, like I said, I came home, I reached out to Pete and I said, hey, I've got this game design that's pretty far down the road. What do you think about us putting together a computer game? And he foolishly said, yeah, sounds good. Roughly 3 years later, we're still working on it. COVID and real life being in the way, of course. But yeah, we're tinkering away on a PC version of the game, which is the Statis Pro engine is in the board game, you can see it. In the computer game, you won't. It's a very different game engine. So it uses Statis Pro at its heart, but it not you if I took it apart, you'd be like, that's not Statis Pro.
How is it that PC gaming maintains that hold over the cards and dice? Do you view it as kind of complementary, or do you view it as, folks tend to like one way or the other?
So I think there's, it's kind of depending on the universe you're in, right? So I remember I played with my kids. I played Madden, right? I played, and I bought an Atari computer in 1979. So I played Micro League. I played, all of them over time. And I think it has to do with, it depends on the crowd. So I think the older crowd tends to like the helper kind of things. Some of these board games that have like a helper, right? You kind of see the card on the screen and it'll roll the dice, but it won't really do much else, right? Okay, that's fine, if that's what you want. But I've been involved with a lot of computer game design and development for some very large computer games that exist. I prefer the career sim. I want the game to basically take care of all of the stuff for me and give me a very compelling engine. Front Office Football did that with a very ugly interface. Draft Day Sports does an okay job at it. Now, Gary's a friend of mine. It's a decent game. I'm not a Madden fan. I know the person when Electronic Arts added franchise mode, I know the guy they hired to add it. He's a friend of mine, and so I'm not going to throw him under the bus either. I'm not going to say ill, but Madden really has never grasped that part of it, right? They invented for 1 year, they invented season ticket baseball, which I think was Purisan baseball for 1 year, rebranded, and Ginden's Front Office Football was season ticket football for 1 year, right? And then they threw them away and said, we're going to make our own. We'll bolt them on. And, a lot of people inside the Madden world don't like the franchise mode because it doesn't work very well. Now, Madden is one of those titles where it's $1 billion title, 500 plus people work on it. And then the next game in the football market is less than $5 million in sales. So there's a whole universe there, and for us, that was where I'm looking to be in that middle. Our game is not going to have moving sprites and VR and all those really $1 billion kind of things. My heart lies with the strategy of it. I'm more interested in being the coach and being the GM than I am in watching whatever my sprites are going to do and make some fancy catch. And how fast can I press the button? I haven't been a button masher fan for, I don't know, since I became an old man. I didn't have the dexterity to do it anymore.
So the PC game, I mean, it'll be a corollary, I guess, in some regards to your season-based, statistics-based game, right? And it's always curious because speaking of Madden, I mean, I always wonder about those ratings and at what point does the CPU kind of overshadow the statistical reality of you playing, say, a winless team or an undefeated team? I mean, it feels like sometimes the game tries to maybe normalize those two disparities even when you're playing, and then you've got to add player skill level, rookie, intermediate, pro, grandmaster, whatever. And I think it just seems to kind of jumble up all the different realities.
Yeah. That's one of the things about button mashers that makes it kind of difficult to do is how do you show a 1976 Tampa Bay Buccaneers god awful terrible team versus the Chiefs or the 72 Dolphins or whatever, right? And you've got some human that I could be the Buccaneers, be Leroy Selman. I could destroy the Miami offense, right? Well, is that real? Would that really have happened? Of course not. That offensive line would have taken care of Selman pretty quickly.
Yeah.
But is that real? And I think that sometimes with the button mashing kind of game and the ratings from Madden are tied to actual player contracts. These guys actually play the game, they model for the game, they do all these things for the game. And being a 99 is like their life dream. I know that there's an army of people out there rating the players, but it's like what happened with Avalon Hill with the Statis Pro games. The game that Jim Barnes handed them and the game that they produced was like A and B. They were not the same thing. And so did you do a good job in what you wanted to present, and then it went through the corporate and it suddenly turned into this? Because we can sell it to a lot more 12-year-olds and 13-year-old boys and girls if they're this than if they are reality, right? You know, the franchise all-stars and all these things. I think it kind of messes up the game systems, and for me you have to really suspend reality when you play the button mashing game. You just kind of go, okay, yes, I know I'm the 76 Buccaneers, but you know, I can be the different players, and therefore I will play them better than they were, right? He's no longer rated a 54. I'm playing him, so he's a 99 because look how fast I can press the button. To me, there's the problem for me with those games now.
Sure.
You know, is that normalization that occurs with the human element is just too strong. What do? Make everybody that's the non-human 99, you know, to make because the human's going to be 99. I don't. Yeah, I think it defies reality, I think, too much.
My gaming history starts right about when you two fellows met, right around 78. Not only did you live through that period where you're board gaming and you've got some really cool early engines, I mean, maybe a little rules heavy Avalon Hill war games, but then you're starting to get, you know, the Commodore 64, the Texas Instruments, some handheld consoles. You've had electric football, but you're starting to edge into more, you know, computer and console until you hit the 90s. And you're also a computer guy. How did you both kind of navigate, and really also from the fantasy side into the sports side? And how did you view the evolution of the fantasy gaming and the sports gaming? Was it a good thing to you to see the computer side coming in and PC and digital in the 90s and 2000s, or did you have some sense of how you'd hoped it developed?
Go ahead, Pete. I've talked too much.
Well, from the fantasy point of view, I actually don't like the more recent versions of D&D compared to the old ones that we grew up on. And I mean, quite frankly, I've purposely not developed an interest in World of Warcraft because I have a feeling that's basically what, you know, if you look at what people like Tim and I, if World of Warcraft had existed in 1978, we probably would have been playing it. But, you know, I looked at it and I'm like, if I really get interested in this, it's going to, every waking moment that I'm not spending working, I'm going to spend playing this game. So, you know, it's just too much. But yeah, there have been some interesting, you know, D&D engines out there, like the Baldur's Gate games and the Neverwinter's Nights games that were used. This is quite a bit back now. I played a bunch of those. I think the computer can add a lot. There's a lot, and what we're doing with this engine, there's a lot you can do with the computer engine that you can't do if humans have to implement the engine. That's the big limitation with a board game, is people can only wrap their minds around so much. You know, if you're asking them to do real complex calculations and keep track of too much, you know, it's just that you don't want to do it, and it detracts from the enjoyment of the game. You're like, I'm spending all my time keeping track of this grunt work instead of enjoying what I'm doing. The computer releases you from all that. The computer can do, you know, orders of magnitude more grunt work than you can, and that's what we're taking advantage of to make the engine more realistic, but still the player doesn't have to worry. The computer's taking care of all that stuff. We bake, you know, mountains of statistics into this thing so that the behavior seems realistic. You know, like if you're playing the 76 Buccaneers, they're going to play like the 76 Buccaneers, like Tim was saying, because that's what we're going to base the numbers on. And you're going to be like, boy, this team's really bad. It's like, well, yeah, you picked the bad team to play. But that's, you know, now you're getting the experience, the realistic experience of what it was like to coach that team and getting frustrated. Whereas if you're playing the 72 Dolphins, you know, yeah, you're probably going to win, you know, win a lot of games and enjoy it a lot. We're making use of the computer to give that extra realism, you know, because the computer is doing all the work.
You're talking about 350 categories of rating every player. And even back then, I mean, now you're saying, I think, Tim, you'd said 2,353 players suited up for at least one game in the 2021 season. This is no mean feat.
Yep.
No. So we have several different statistical sites that we pull information from. And over the years, I've developed different formulas to rate the players and to translate statistics. Because, what we're finding, of course, is, and this is one of the limitations the board game has had over the years. And I think one of the reasons I've been told that it hasn't really grasped like the Delphi world, right? If I make an announcement about my football game, you could hear a pin drop, right? Because I'm talking about 2019 or something, right? Well, they want to talk about 1979, right? They want those seasons, right? We all grew up on those seasons. And the way the engine developed in the beginning was it started with modern. It started with the season, right? And way back when I did Football Bones, I did rate 1979. I did rate 81. I sold a couple of those card sets. Unfortunately, I had a hard drive crash a few years ago. Like an idiot, I carried a hard drive overseas and broke it. And I lost a lot of the formulas. I lost a lot of that basic card rating. So I've spent some time rebuilding it. We're actually, one of the things that Pete and I are working on right now is the ability for the game to generate seasons pretty much on its own, right? Obviously, I'm going to come back and I'm going to check everything. I'm the guy who reads every line of every card and whatever, but it can at least generate 2,000 players for me, and I'm not sitting there with the old standard typewriter and writing, typing their name and their team and their ratings or whatever, right? Let the computer give me, if we feed it enough information, it should give me pretty good data. NFL wasn't keeping track of stats prior to 1982 until a recent project by the Pro Football Researchers Association, which I'm a member, which actually sat and read all those books, right? Actually read all the playbooks and did a pretty amazing job, right? We got to see if Deacon Jones really was the sack leader, right? That age-old question, Bruce Smith, Deacon Jones. The numbers are coming, but of course, as we know, a lot of it is handwritten. It's like reading old baseball stuff, right? Luckily, baseball guys, Bill James, even before him, were really geeks and into numbers. And they really wanted to know all of this stuff. Football has come along much later with fantasy football. After rotisserie baseball was invented or showed up, then fantasy football and these other things started to appear in more numbers, right? But I was actually having this discussion the other day with somebody about the play-by-play in old NFL playbooks. So if the line of play-by-play says Dan Marino to Mark Clayton 14 yards, all you know is it's a 14-yard completion. Was he 2 yards off the line and he ran an out? Did he throw it 14 yards to get tackled right then? Right. One of the things today is air yards, right? How is that information broken down? And there's some extrapolating you can do. There's some guesswork you can do with that, but some of it is also there's also a compare and contrast of what it looked like now and what we know it looked like then, right? There is old film. You kind of get a sense of what they were doing, right? The Packers sweep and those kinds of plays. You get a sense of it. You can't get exact, but you get a sense of what they were doing, right? And we can extrapolate out and we can guesswork it. And one of the things that we're going to do as we get further down the road with this, once we start to really not alpha test, but really beta test the engine with people, is I'm going to ask them to look at our ratings, right? I'm not going to show them behind the curtain, but they're going to look at the ratings and say, oh yeah, he shouldn't be this highly rated there because I remember when I was a kid, he was, right? And we'll take the anecdotal is as good as we've got for a lot of this. We can't translate it anymore, right? We don't have game film on every single game, on every single play. I saw your interview you did with Ron about data driven, right? He's got one of the issues of that too, where NFL Game Pass is great, but it only takes you back so far, right? And we have that same problem where these things only take you back so far. So recently I have all the card sets back to 2009, and I do this for both games, for PTG and for Solo, where I have all of those players or teams. But finding the information going further back is more difficult, especially before 2006. So we're in the process now of translating and working on. The season I chose was 1979. If we can get 1979 right, we're okay. I can do 1942. I can do 1987 after that. There's a translation that exists across it.
Is there any intention for your game to potentially normalize if you had the hankering to put Sammy Baugh up against Tom Brady or something like that? Or, what are your thoughts about that whole inter-era, cross-era normalization conversation?
Personally, I want Sammy Baugh to perform like Sammy Baugh did. I want Dan Marino to be Dan Marino then. I want Patrick Mahomes to be Patrick Mahomes now. I can't guess what those guys would have necessarily done, right? Roger Staubach ran like crazy, right? Franz Harkington ran like crazy. But is that Lamar Jackson? No, it's a different style of offense, completely different style of offense. Those guys back in the day, most of them acknowledged they could never run today's offense, and the guys in today's offenses could never run yesterday's offenses. They're so very different in the way that they operate. There's so much complexity in what looks like a very simple 11 on 11 kind of thing. There's a ton of complexity that happens inside of it. And we're seeing that the NFL has this next gen stats where they've got the players with the chips, right? Whole other level of data, right? So we're understanding that between that and the helmets with the concussions, all that data, right? All that interplay of all this data is changing the way that the game is played. Old timers, we've seen this plenty of times on forums and people messaging and things about how today's players are so much softer and whatever than yesterday's players. Yesterday's players didn't weigh 350 pounds and run 4.5 40s. Yesterday's players, the starting offensive tackle was 220 and he ran a 5.4. Those guys yesterday would have been killed by the guys today. Physically, they're just two different animals. I think the cross era thing is overblown. I think it's overdone. People I want to play. Well, you can play. Put those two teams in together. They're going to play like they played. You understand their strengths and weaknesses, right? One of the things that our game is going to have is it's going to have coaches. The coaches are going to be different, right? Jim Harbaugh is going to coach differently than Don Shula, then Curly Lambeau, then I just went blank on the guy whose name's on the trophy.
Lombardi, right?
Lombardi, yeah.
Could have been Landry, though. Could have been Landry.
Landry, one of my favorites. I'm a long-term Cowboy fan. That's one of the things that we're going to try and have in our game that's going to be different than most, I think, is that other level of beyond the player. The coaches are actually going to matter. Their decision-making, the way that which plays they run, how often do they run those plays, their coaching philosophy. We're going to try and capture as much of that as we can. And as other games do over time, you tweak things as you go. As we learn more as we go, as we start to learn more about and more data is gathered in real life, we'll make adjustments to our game engine. But that's one of the things that, Pete, you want to talk about the way that we have our game engine is going to be learning, is a learning engine.
Yeah, it's going to be, most of the expectation is, the user is only going to be running one team. Like if he's in solo campaign mode where he's running a CD, he picks one team, he's the coach and GM. The AI is running the other 31 teams. And so it's using all that data that Tim talked about how the coach calls plays, all the different data on the players, and it's running all those teams. And as it's running the teams, it's learning. Like every time it plays your team, it's going to remember, okay, this guy likes to run this particular type of play in this situation. It's going to be keeping track of all that. And it might change the way it plays you next time, just like a real team would. That's one of the elements of realism that we want to add to this.
You couldn't take the 76 Bucks and have them have enough success that it builds that team up into a better team, right? It's not necessarily that.
Probably not. I mean, if the die rolls all came up, inside the computer, all came up, double sixes long enough, you could do that. But yeah, it's going to be highly unlikely. There's a limit to how much it can learn because it still has it's limited by the tools it has to work with. And that's $6. It's got that team and that's it. That's
one of the differences too is ours is going to be a career sim. So you start out as the 76 Bucks, but you get to the next season, your draft, yes, there you have an element where you can actually have it import the historic draft. So you have that same roster. And as long as you don't make any actual player moves, you could have a pure teams, right? You can lock out that where you don't have any moves. But if you start signing free agents and I did it in micro league. I remember playing micro league baseball and I remember making one signing. I was the 63 Dodgers. I remember making one signing and I was like, no, this is just wrong. I can't do this. I want pure, right? But you could do that. So by the time you moved to the next season, you are no longer the 76 Buccaneers. You've moved on to your own version. You've played them. They've developed. There is a career arc. Players will develop or undevelop, however you want to, get better or worse over time, over a career arc, right? So they will, and there is personalities in here too. So player personality and the way they interact with their coaches and their teammates and all that, all the other elements can change the way the teams develop. If you play just single season replay and you just play that one, then yeah, you'll be the 76 Bucks. And yeah, you're going to get killed by the Dolphins more times than not by far, probably 2/3, 3/4 or more. Right. But if you are playing a career sim, you start out as the Buccaneers and your desire is to build them to be, what was it? 80, 79, 80, when Doug Williams led them to
79. Yeah.
79. Right. So if you want to lead them to success, can you do it faster than Doug Williams did? Right. Right. You can do that because it's kind of like in that same vein. If you take as a pure 76 league, right? If you start plucking players off the Raiders and you start plucking players off the Browns and whatever, right? Players are going to naturally retire. They're going to get better. They're going to get worse. Automatically, the moment you started the game, and this is true in any computer game, really, and even in the board games, the moment you start playing, you're no longer playing it pure. Because the reality of different dice rolls occurs, different moves by the AI, different move. Even if you left it pure, the AI is going to do things differently, right? It's like a card and dice baseball game, right? Oh, that third game, I lost 9-8. In reality, it was 17-4. Well, you decided to walk instead of, the third guy up walked instead of struck out. So in the first inning, you had defied reality, right? You no longer were 3 up and 3 down. You were suddenly, you got a hit or you got a walk or something changed, right? And the die rolls changed and your strategy changed and you didn't do it pure. Yeah, you did as played lineups, but they didn't play exactly the same.
Man, that just opened up a bunch of conversations about sample size and running through all these different parameters, but also kind of that, the fantasy aspect of it. And maybe Peter or either of you wants to address kind of the idea of, because you mentioned, Tim, the coach's card and the personalities, which is massive to me. It's like the numbers are one thing, but can you get some of that leadership, some of that personality, an Elway, you're looking at these guys who, the leagues emphasize these characters on the field, and there's a motivational aspect. Lambert has a team meeting in 76, players only meeting, whatever. And since you come from the fantasy side, adding those kind of intangibles, those human factors, What's your take on how that happens? I mean, in D&D or any of the role-playing games, you're kind of almost like you're building a script. It's like you're writing characters in a movie or a series, and they have an arc, irrespective or parallel to the statistical aspect of this game. It's really fascinating. I'm just kind of curious how you're balancing all these elements.
Tim calls it role building, and that's when we played D&D. That was what we were into. I mean, we still have reams and reams of stuff we wrote about the stuff that happened. We kept track for years and years of what the characters did, and they would get married and have kids, and new players would come in, and all this stuff going on. We had kingdoms changing hands and all kinds of stuff. Yeah, this is the same kind of thing. We want to give the player the ability to build their own world of the NFL. That's not, it'll start out being based on something that happened in real life, but yeah, you're going to start doing your own thing with it. You're going to start building your own characters, adding your own personality to it, and it becomes your version of the NFL. You might play this for 10, 20, 30, game years, so to speak, seasons, where at the end of season 30, what you've got looks nothing like what any real NFL season looked like. It's got your personal stamp on it. And you can also, we talked about single player mode, but you can also play in a league. You can have a league where, say, you have 10 of you and 10 other friends, each have a team, and the AI runs the teams that humans aren't running. And so, you're all together running, and you can run season after season where you're all making your own trades and adding your own personal stamp on it. And imagine 30 seasons of that, where the same thing that happens in the board games, except now you've got a lot more to work with because the computer can keep track of so much more that you can't keep track of in a board game. So yeah, we definitely want to have that open to people where they can build their own fantasy version of the NFL, over years and years of simulated play.
Are you going to build a Mac version for us Mac people?
Yes. We intend to support Windows, Mac, and Linux. I'm a Linux guy. Tim's a Windows guy. So yeah, we have to cover them all.
Awesome.
Yeah, we're actually writing it being written in Python, and graphics is coded in Qt. So
yeah, everything's cross-platform.
Cross-platform, but there is the intention, the plan to actually do mobile. So, obviously stripped down, it can't be as robust, but stripped down version. Yeah. And this is just the first. The football game is the first. Hockey will be next. And then I want to do basketball. And I've actually had people who own other board games have actually come to me and said, hey, when you're done with football, what do you think about doing my game in a computer version? And I'm like, we'll talk about it but yeah, it's certainly, we're actually developing, the way we're developing this is not as a one-off game, right? So our entire process is building a platform, right? So we want to be able to do multiple games that have the same basic look and feel, but also cross-platform, are strategic in nature, strategy, depth of play, right? There'll be some moving sprites, but nothing fancy in the beginning, right? That, as I give Pete all the time a hard time about this, is I would love to be Madden out of the gate, but I don't have that kind of money. So we're going to do something that's significantly less, right? So in our first version, the sprites may not move, but that's okay. They'll move next year, right? We'll get there, right? It's these things are evolutionary. One of the things that's different about the board games, right? When people buy APBA, they want APBA. They don't want APBA Advanced, APBA Masters. They don't want 17 different versions. They want APBA, right? And then they're going to play APBA, right? You know this. How many times have they? Oh, I'm not playing the Master. I'm not playing. Right? I'm only playing the original, right? And we're the same way with the computer game. I make small changes to the board game every year. I always come up with some new fancy little change to the game I don't want the football board game to become too cumbersome, right? So the solo game has stayed exactly that. It is very much a very, very light version of the full-blown game, because it actually uses team sheets. The PTG football actually uses player cards like Statis Pro, right? And if there's a lot of numbers on those little cards, I can do a whole lot more inside the computer version. And I have all these ideas and all these things that I've worked on and tinkered with over the years that allow me to run wild. It drives Pete crazy because he gets calls from me. Hey, I just came up with this, and he goes, "Oh God, no!" Means I have to rewrite how much, because I've decided that I just was it a month ago? I came up with a new way to do a blitz versus a pass rush, right? And because in the board game, they're basically the same thing, roughly, right? And I had this epiphany one day about an idea, and I wrote it all up, and I called him and I emailed him and I said, "Hey, I got this," and I could just hear in his voice going, "Just don't." But it actually, once we talked it through and worked it through, it actually works better. It's actually more efficient, and it's actually deeper and it's more realistic. I did add it to the board game in a simplified version, adding those small little changes to a board game versus the sandbox that is the computer, right? And as Pete was saying, we have reams of data, mountains of data that we can use, and we can really build a much more robust world with it.
Tell me about rendering these mechanics. I mean, I love that people are coming to say, "Do my game next." Golf, I mean, seems like, or car racing, even tennis. I mean, it's like an individual. So maybe is that maybe something that even lends itself more to a career mode? Second question. When you're talking about you want to do hockey and basketball, you've got a process and you've got mechanics, but the sports are so different. And you're talking about maybe, I mean, if you want to get down to the muscle groups that athletes use in certain kinds of games, hockey does a certain thing, baseball is a whole different animal. How much core material can you work with before you have to really start branching out and addressing those mechanics? And would those single player sports maybe lend themselves more to a career mode?
It's funny, golf is one of those games that on the computer, if you look at the landscape of the computer games that are out there, they don't lend themselves well to the one element that I like that Pete mentioned that I really want to do is I like the role playing, the role building, right? I want you to take a role and not just watch from the sidelines, right? I can't stand watch from the sideline kind of games. And I think that with the single player, like a golf, like an auto racing or tennis and some of these, you can do that role playing, but I think in a way you end up with too much off field messing around, right? With tennis, you have to do this to get sponsors, and you have to attend these press conferences, and you must do these, events and things. And I'm just thinking to myself, but that's not the game I want to play, right? It's like I know there are some computer games where they want you to figure out, are you selling hot dogs or not? Who cares? If I'm worried about in a multi-billion, this is one of the things that I think is so interesting about football, for example, is these teams don't lose money. Okay. Their wealth and their ability is just endless, right? And so do I care? Baseball teams are the same way, whether really it's the Pirates or the Yankees, right? And yes, they are very different economics, but the Pirates are not necessarily deciding, do we sell hot dogs or not, or what brand necessarily. And that's nickel and diming it, right? Do I want to sit there playing a computer game that I'm worried about that level of detail, when I would rather personally, if I'm going to worry about that level of detail, I want to know if I'm going to use my third running back on which formations. That's the level of detail I'm going to worry about. Is that third running back going to be my fullback? Is it going to be, and where am I going to use him? That's where I want that level of, so for the individual type of sport, the tennis and things, I don't think they lend themselves quite as well, because I think you spend too much time not doing it right. To really play a computer tennis game, you really have to have the button mashing, right? The ball coming across, and you have to do the timing of the ball, and do I hit the ball, or like in my case, playing so many video games of tennis, swinging and missing. Golf is kind of there. I know there's a couple of them out there where you're not the guy per se standing on the tee, but you see the ball fly through the air and it lands, and you've got like a realistic golf course and whatever, but you're still, to me, you're spending too much time not playing golf, not practicing golf, because you're not, just because I can decide, the parameters, I can figure out the math of, oh, if I do this shot this way, based on the way the computer already has the wind blowing this way and whatever, I kind of figure out the cheat codes, as it were. Do I really have to practice that like a Tiger Woods or a Dustin Johnson or, Tom Watson or whoever? No, I'm not practicing for hours and hours and hours. And how do you tweak that a little bit? Yeah, you're playing some practice rounds, but really, you just have a terrible career for a few years. You figure out, it finally dawns on you one day what the numbers are to hit the places, to be in the fairways and to hit the green and bounce it the right way. And all of a sudden your career takes off. You didn't really practice, you played, you just were terrible in the career mode for a couple of years. So, that's one thing with our football game. Yeah, we're rating players across an insane number of categories, but we're also rating, can a defensive lineman be a punter? Right? I know. Do you really want to see your quarterback be the safety? For all the positions that Taysom Hill played, he's not doing that anymore. Right? It was the Wildcat, right? It was for, it lasted 10 minutes. Now it's over. But you want to have, as we've saw with the real life USFL this past year, they started out with 37-man rosters in real life, right? Then they realized all of a sudden these guys can't play two ways. They can't play that much. They get hurt easily because, again, it's 350-pound men smashing into each other at God knows how many miles an hour and ripping themselves up. And all of a sudden you watch the number of players on the roster in real life go up and up and up until it was 40 some by the end of the season. And next year it's going to be 50 some, I believe, because they realized that all of a sudden they're signing these guys off the street, right? I think the championship game, there was people playing who had been signed 3 days before. Really?
Shades of 1987,
Yeah.
Speaking of usage and that third running back, or if you want to go back to single wing, do you, given the freedom that you're giving your players in the football game and maybe other games, what is your take on how to kind of gently guide users to use the game as it's intended? I mean, APBA is famous for its use it the way, but you can't run this guy twice and don't, whatever. I mean, whatever game, there's a way to kind of really go nuts with it. What's your take, both of you, on kind of, I think, you mentioned the Cowboys. I always go back to, 71, where like Staubach and Morton, at least in one game, are going every other play, or the 78 Broncos, where they had a rotating cast of 6 running backs to kind of keep them all fresh. I mean, how do you guide or instruct people to kind of keep it real, if you will, within the context of the era, the team, the actual player usage, or are you just going to let them go to town and let the AI kind of work with that?
Well, I mean, as far as what's possible in the game, pretty much anything is possible. The game, certain stats, like, we mentioned running backs will have, we call it a rest rate. So, some running backs, you can run every play. They never get tired. Others, no, and the stats will tell you that. You'll know that when you look at the player. It's, after he runs one, so he's tired, he's got to sit out for a few plays. Some of them have to sit out for I think it's as long as a quarter for the worst one, if you don't want him penalized. And so, those things will naturally happen in the game. You'll find out that, you can't run all your running, you can't run a 3 running back formation every play and just switch round robin who gets the run. They're going to get tired and you're going to get beaten up. So yeah, the game you'll end up finding out what works and what doesn't. Hopefully fairly realistically compared to what you would find out if you tried those same things in the real world. But as far as what you can try, yeah, there's not a lot of limitations. You can experiment with all kinds of different formations and different ways of running people. It's like Tim said, you could put people in positions that they weren't really, supposed to be playing in the real world. You could put your quarterback in as a safety. He'll have numbers. They'll be terrible, but you could do it. The game's not going to stop you. It's just going to show you by what happens when you do that that's probably not a good idea.
Getting back to the idea of sample size, that's one of the things that kind of comes up a lot. Let's say you calculate a season set for board or for computer. You've graded the teams based on their record and their offensive and defensive capabilities, and then within that context, you now execute the players' individual abilities to be reflected within the context of that team. But how do you then become satisfied with your design and your mechanics? Say if you did 50 replays of whatever Super Bowl or whatever 1-point conference championship game, what is your kind of threshold for satisfaction in proving out your engine?
So I run about 10,000 to 20 to 50, maybe even sometimes 100,000 simulations of individual teams, individual players, individual games. I just kind of pick and choose, right? So like you said, like a 1-point conference championship, right? How often can I get it to do that again, right? Or how often is it where, because of maybe there's some weather effects, right? Maybe the game was close because of some weather, right? And maybe our game maybe it doesn't take that kind of weather quite into effect enough, right? It doesn't, maybe it doesn't build in the guy slipping more than he maybe does, right? Or the better cleats or whatever. So I try to run it minimum of 10,000 times to try and get within a tolerance of less than 1% of acceptable results. And for me, acceptable results is realistic. It doesn't have to be spot on. Because he ran 10 times in real life in the season and picked up 10.3 yards, in our game, he may run 50 times, right? It's the AI is going to make the decision that maybe at that particular play, even with the limitations that he has as having a very high rest rate and being very limited, yes, he's very good for short bursts, right? The die rolls are going to come up. Every computer game is a die roll. Every board game is a die roll, right? And we roll up to 100,000 sided dice, to make the simulations work properly, rather than just 2 10-sided dice as percentiles, right? We run much larger sets of numbers because I can, frankly. The great thing about the computer, I could never put it on a piece of card, but running it just hundreds of thousands of times potentially to try and get it to be in a good tolerance, right? So, the zero rest rate, the guy who ran all the time, right? The Larry Zonkas of the world, the Derrick Henrys, right? These guys who just are the bulwark, they are the bulls of the team. They are the workhorses of the team. Yes, you want to make sure those guys are within tolerance. Now, one of the things we break down is every single run that they do, we track every single run, so we know how many yards they ran, and we try to make sure that, and I have certain benchmarks that I look at. Right. I don't look at every single yardage and go, oh, I must be, because that's just way too much. Right. But if I find benchmarks and I look for those benchmarks, and if they're within tolerance of the benchmark, I'm good. I'm not going to stress and strain over getting every single number to be perfect, because there's just literally millions of numbers. We have spreadsheets that have 1.8 million cells of information. I didn't look at 1.8 million cells. I just made sure they worked. And if they worked, great. If they didn't, then yeah, I went trolling around looking for what the anomalies were, but I'm not I'm just not going to be tied to. I know some guys love to do these comparisons. In 1947, the players were this, and I did this, and it was this, and I played the game twice, and he didn't do it, and it's broken. And it's like, no, you only played it twice. Come back to me at 10,000. Talk to me maybe at 100. Don't talk to me at twice. Don't talk to me even at 5 or 10 or 20. Because it's just, to me, the sample sizes are too small.
Although in that regard, in that instance, if someone does come back without whatever game and says it, it didn't work out, is that user error, or is that maybe indicative of potential issues with the game engine?
It could be both. I mean, it could be, did the user make the same decisions, right? Because that, to me, that's ultimately, did the user make the same decisions, right? If you're doing a football game, did they actually run the same number of times in the same situations, right? If all of a sudden the guy doesn't run as well because you're running him on 3rd and 1, and he's not that kind of back, the defense is calling it, they know he's going to get the ball, and they're slamming into the line and they shut him down, versus, are you running him inside? Are you running him outside? Right? Give me a little bit more sample size, a little bit more information. I'm not looking to say the user's wrong, because the user's never wrong, right? Their experience is their experience, right? We've all had them, right? We've all stopped and said, oh, the game is broken. Oh no, and then we played it again and we're like, oh no, it works fine. Because we're looking for something, and it's sometimes it's there and sometimes it's not. And if we don't see it, or we're not looking for it, it's not there. It's fine. So that's why I'm saying that I think sample size is very important. I really get annoyed with comments that I see people write or whatever about, oh, the game must be broken because XYZ. And I'm like, you played 3 games, you played 2 games. Does that really mean the game, which has been played hundreds or thousands of times, really broken? Or anecdotally, did you have the experience? Because we all know how anecdotal is, right? Anecdotal is actually a Yelp review. Anecdotally, I had a terrible time at a 5-star Michelin restaurant. Great, 5,000 other people around you had a wonderful time. You had a bad time for whatever reason.
I've written the question, and you hit right on it about how people, what they're looking for. I was looking for this to happen, and this didn't happen, and maybe it's the perceptions of the game. We're talking about data, and you'd mentioned also, like, if I can get this one season right, I can get these other seasons right. But are there times when your data kind of debunks a perception of a particular player, that maybe, I don't know, and I don't have the data in front of me. I mean, Earl Campbell, tree trunk legs was just pounded everyone into dirt, or Ricky Williams versus, maybe your scat back, but have you ever found that, in your data, or will you look for these kind of instances where the perception of a player is kind of debunked by the data, maybe a little bit, maybe, the AFL, the high flying AFL, but maybe there are some teams that really didn't excel at the long ball, the vertical game in that sense, and maybe they weren't as efficient as memory serves. How do you kind of deal with that?
Pete, we were just talking about this the other day with Walter Payton.
Yeah. Some of it is, you don't have a lot of data from those, from a lot of those older seasons. So, I mean, what numbers we do have on Walter Payton certainly don't say he was bad, and it's, I mean, yeah, you're going to compare, you got this little sparse set of data that you're comparing, one guy against another and say, was he better than, I forget what was another, like Larry Zonk. I think we have that data from the same season. Their numbers are fairly similar. Were they really the same? No. So you have to allow for that. I don't know how much you can really debunk with that sparse a set of data. We have to use our memory to help validate the data in some respects. Do I want to work with this? What it says compared to what I remember, because that's how the user is going to look at it. You know, if the game doesn't say Walter Payton was a great running back, they're going to say your game sucks. They're not going to say, oh, well, your data must be better than mine. So yeah, you have to take that into account. Where we have more recent seasons, you know, where we have lots and lots of data, you know, yeah, there are probably, I don't know that we run across any specific one that comes to mind, but yeah, there will probably be cases where our data is where we have a lot of it is going to be saying this player is a little different than what the common perception was. Some of them might be a little worse. Some of them might be a little better. There might be some players that when you look at the data and you start running on this game, they're going to do better than you remember them doing in real life, you know, for any of a number of reasons. So yeah, that can certainly happen.
We've talked about the extremes. It's always the 72 Dolphins, the 76 Bucks, the 08 Lions, you know, the 2007 Patriots. When you're looking at these teams, I mean, isn't it almost like a bell curve? I mean, you've got, say, in 76, go back there, you've got the 13-1 Raiders on the other end of those, you know, so that's a fairly dramatic spread. But in the middle of that, you know, whether it's the 70s, 80s, 90s, or the aughts, you know, the difference between those two loss teams, the two win teams in that whole area in the middle, I mean, how much variation? Maybe it's 4 wins or 4 losses. There's really not a whole lot of discernible. I mean, it's a lot of just a few plays here and there. It's maybe 500 yards total offense defense. I mean, how do you reflect that in the game? Do you try to get a little deeper then into the personality to kind of make the team play a little differently than that kind of middling general defense or offense?
Yeah, so one of the things that we tried, and you mentioned like the Lions, right? So think of Calvin Johnson, right? How amazing was Calvin Johnson, right? And then you look at the team and you go, yeah, they were terrible, but Calvin Johnson was amazing, right? And so how do you make the standout player stand out? How do you make the terrible player terrible, right? And then how do you make the teams, like you said, all these teams in the middle, right? There is as Ron was saying last week, and we've noticed this too, there is very little difference between the top teams and the bottom teams. It really is a play here, a play there, right? And the play doesn't have to be the last play of the game. It could be a running play in the 5 minutes into the third quarter. It could be some singular play that when you looked back at it, you went, whoa, if they had just done X instead of Y, then all the dominoes don't fall, right? One of the things that we've tried to do with having the players be individually rated is that it allows for enough variation between players that when you look at all the running backs for 1979, right, and you pick out the Franco Harris and the Walter Payton and the Mike Murawski, right, the quarterback or whoever, right, you pick out these different players, there isn't really that much statistical difference between them. Right, the old adage of 3 yards in a cloud of dust, right? That was Earl Campbell, right? We all seen the YouTube videos where the jersey gets ripped off and he's running down the field, and yeah, he's got the big tree trunk legs and you know and everything. And of course, we you know, in our modern day, we now picture him what that turned him into, right? All that physical destruction turned the man into, right? I think that with our game, we try to show where there's going to be a period, there's a set of yards where Campbell smashed into line and then was stopped. It's like Barry Sanders. Barry either went really forward or really backward. Very little in the middle, right? You know, and that's how Barry Sanders actually really plays out, right? Is you either hit Barry in the backfield and knock him down, because he was too busy trying to spin every which way, or he got a couple of spins and he was gone, right? And I mean, Barry's the prime example of that. And so we've tried with all the various elements that the players have, and player personality plays into it. You know, the way that the player wants to be used or not be used, right, plays into their abilities on the field. You know, you will see you're not going to see dramatic swings of players. You know, even if the player is rated the most obnoxious in the history of the planet, right, he's the biggest jerk ever, that's not necessarily going to make him either a superstar or the worst guy on the field, right? That's how he is off the field. He puts on the helmet, he goes out, he does his job, right? He's the biggest jerk off the field. He doesn't like his contracts, he doesn't like his usage, he doesn't like whatever, right? But how many times in the history of the NFL have you ever seen Antonio Brown's? Once. One time. And even Antonio Brown afterwards went, oops, my bad. You know, it just doesn't happen. They put the helmet on and they just go to work. And because of football is one of those really weird sports where I think baseball does this too in somewhat, which is, for example, with injuries, right? If you have a player on a football field get hurt and he's not Tom Brady, he's the backup left guard, right? Nobody's going to mention the guy's name. He is going to disappear. He's going to walk off the field. You're not going to see him limp. There's going to be no stretcher. He's going to walk off. He's going to say something to the trainers. The trainers are going to go, you're done, right? But you're not going to hear Al Michaels make some big story and spend 45 minutes talking about it, right? You're never going to hear about this guy, right? Or how many guys get hurt and the reason we've changed kickoff rules. How many guys get hurt doing that? The kick coverage, right? We don't hear about those guys and their injuries.
Well, let's go back to 79. Let's say if you executed a trade or a draft or whatever, and somehow Montana goes to the Buccaneers, or class of 83, maybe the Steelers pick Marino, or maybe they don't let Unitas go or Dawson go or God knows who else. Can those players then grow into the players they were within those new systems, or does that alter the trajectory a bit?
It will alter their trajectory. Different coaches, different systems, different surrounding players, right? Would Tom Brady have been Tom Brady if he had been, right? If Drew Bledsoe had not been hurt, would we have ever known about Tom Brady? Would Tom Brady have ever married Giselle? Would any of these things ever have occurred? Probably not, right? I'm guessing, right? All things being equal, how many times do you think this quarterback comes out of college and he's going to be the next thing since sliced bread and you never hear from the guy again, right? Josh Rosen was drafted 10th. He's on like his 10th team now, right? You know, we can ignore the Ryan Leafs of the world, right? Those guys, but Andre Ware, right? Andre Ware was supposed to be, how many of those quarterbacks? I think Montana would have still been historically great, but I think the West Coast helped him. The West Coast is a very different animal in that era and nobody had known it, right? Bill Walsh took that system and expanded it and made it to what it was. And he took that complement of players around, right? The Taylors, the Rices, the Rathmans, the whoever, right? The offensive line. He took those guys and he built a very complementary system on a dink and dunk offense. Montana didn't have the arm to do what Marino did. Would Marino have played well in a dink and dunk system where he could, like Roethlisberger standing there getting hit play after play after play? Could Montana have withstood that kind of? No, he had to get rid of the ball fast because while the line could block, they weren't going to be able to block for more than about 2.5 seconds. He was going to get hit with a Marino, right? Marino's a bigger dude, right? And if he didn't run historically, right, 200 carries minus 200 yards or whatever it is, right? Historically, just slam into line and fall down, right? But that's because he didn't have the speed. He couldn't move around. But in the offense, he could throw to Clayton and Duper. Long balls, right? And then, of course, it developed with the other receivers, right? Of the way that once his arm weakened down and he couldn't throw as long anymore, that you notice those distances were coming in, right? Shula was no longer able to line up the backs to help Marino as easily, right? They didn't have, remember, historically, they were just, Jim Jensen and who and what, you're like, fearing for the poor guy, for his life out there. Because historically, of course, they weren't drafting linemen. They were trying to draft the speedy receivers and trying to draft and trying to be a sexy team, and it just, Marino looked 5,000 yards awesome. And then he was historically good, yes, Hall of Famer and all that other stuff, but it wasn't as good afterwards. Teams also figured it out, right? They figured him out, right? You know, the defensive coaches are well known for being able to make the changes on the fly. Well, how many times do you see a first half and you're like, wow. And then the second half comes out and all of a sudden that end isn't coming off as you know, he's not coming off as wide anymore. He's moved inside. He's coming in closer, you know, so that extra step he was taking, he's no longer taking that extra step. That time is gone, and he's on top of the quarterback, right? They've made the adjustments. And so I think historically, these quarterbacks probably would still be great, but I don't know that they would have been the icons that they became outside of their systems, outside of their teams. Brady has been consistent, but Bruce Arians also made changes to the way he coached his team. Bruce Arians is very much Bruce Arians wasn't an adapt to my system. He was, I'll adapt my system to you kind of coach, right? And that's one thing our game will be able to do, I hope better than most, is you'll be able to bring players in because you as the coach, you can take on role of GM and or coach, head coach, and you can install your own system. And that will hopefully, if it's done, you know, if we do it correctly, Montana will probably still be Hall of Fame, just not Montana, maybe.
This has been absolutely fascinating. Cannot wait to see this game. Without putting you too much on the spot, I mean, do you have roughly, you'd mentioned that about 2.5 years of work have gone into this, and really a lifetime, I mean, of thinking of the game. It goes beyond that even, but I'm just kind of curious what you're thinking in terms of when you'd like to roll out your testing. I think you talked a little about beta coming up.
Pete?
Well, you keep saying you want to have something out by Christmas.
Yeah.
That's what we're shooting for, somewhere around that time frame. Some beta testers may see something earlier than that, we hope.
Any thoughts about a baseball game?
No.
Okay.
The reason is this, is that I play a lot of Out of the Park, and I know a lot about that game and stuff, and I don't want to compete with Out of the Park. I like Out of the Park as a game. I think it does everything it needs to do in a baseball game. I'm not a big fan of some of the other games. I mean, I was a fan of Purisim when Sean Sullivan was putting Purisim out. I was a fan of that, but I really don't want to try and reinvent the wheel when the wheel's already been perfected. You know, yeah, okay, Out of the Park is a whole lot for a lot of people, but if you play it right, you can strip all of the extras away and just play a very basic generic game and kind of ignore all the bells and whistles, right? As we had when I had the little audio problem in the beginning, right? I had turned the volume down. Just turn the volume down, right? All the bells and whistles go away, right? So I don't really foresee a baseball game. Somebody would really have to bring me an amazing engine for me to you know, an engine that nobody's heard of yet. Right. And I don't even know where that would come from anymore, because I don't know, between MLB, the show, and Out of the Park, which are 1-2 in terms of sales, I don't see really a market there. Again, I'm more of a career sim, not a game helper kind of guy. And I really, since I don't have a game engine that I'm really taken with and really played my life with, I don't see a translation there for me.
Well, gentlemen, thank you so much for your time and all your work. Check them out, folks. This is going to be a really, really cool addition to the gaming landscape, I think.
I appreciate it.
All right. Thanks very much.
Thank you.